The mountain wind whistled through the pines as 5 armed men slowly circled Eleanor Blackwood's remote cabin. Their leader, Jackson Reeves, smirked as he counted just 1 horse in the small stable. A widow alone in the wilderness. Easy pickings for the notorious Reeves gang. They'd take her land, her gold, and whatever else caught their fancy. What they didn't know was that Eleanor Blackwood had modified every window of that humble cabin into precision firing positions. Before becoming a quiet homesteader, she'd been known as Shadow Eleanor, the most decorated sharpshooter in the Union Army's secret Phantom Division during the Civil War. Some mistakes you only make once, and the Reeves gang was about to make their last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning sun filtered through the tall pines surrounding Eleanor Blackwood's cabin, casting dappled shadows across the weathered porch where she sat cleaning her Winchester rifle. At 48, her hands moved with practiced precision, each motion economical and purposeful. The weapon wasn't just a tool for hunting, it was an extension of herself, though few in Pinecrest Valley would ever understand why. Another beautiful day, she murmured to herself, her keen grey eyes scanning the tree line with an awareness that had become second nature over decades. 3 years had passed since she'd settled in this remote corner of Colorado Territory, building a life of quiet solitude after burying both her husband James and the identity she'd carried during the bloodiest years of her life. The cabin itself appeared modest to casual observers, a simple 2-room structure with a stone chimney and sturdy porch. What visitors never noticed were the subtle modifications Eleanor had made. Each window frame was reinforced with iron plating hidden beneath rustic wood. The glass panes were set at carefully calculated angles to reduce glare. The shutters could be quickly secured from the inside with steel bars disguised as decorative elements. Eleanor placed the reassembled rifle in the custom rack by the door and moved inside to prepare for her weekly trip into town. The interior of the cabin revealed more of her true nature than she ever displayed in public. A detailed map of the surrounding territory hung on one wall, marked with notations about sightlines, distances, and terrain features. A bookshelf held volumes on ballistics and meteorology, alongside poetry and novels. In a locked chest beneath her bed lay 4 additional firearms, each meticulously maintained. "Best get moving if I want to beat the noon rush at Pearson's," she reminded herself, gathering a list of supplies needed for the coming week. The general store in Pinecrest was her main connection to the small community, a place where she maintained her carefully crafted persona as a reserved widow who'd moved west to start anew after losing her husband. As she saddled her chestnut mare, Sadie, in the small stable, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the letter she'd received from Marshal Harris. Last week, reports of the Reeves gang moving into the territory troubled her more than she'd let on. She'd tracked their movements through careful conversations with travelers passing through, noting patterns that others missed. Jackson Reeves and his brothers had been systematically targeting isolated homesteads, particularly those owned by women or the elderly, people unlikely to put up significant resistance. The 12-mile ride into Pinecrest gave Eleanor time to organize her thoughts. The trading post town had grown modestly in the 3 years since she'd arrived, now boasting a proper hotel alongside Pearson's General Store, Whitman's Blacksmith, and the Silver Dollar Saloon. As always, Eleanor noted each change, each new face with the automatic assessment of someone trained to spot anomalies. She hitched Sadie outside Pearson's, straightening her simple blue dress and checking that her hair was properly secured beneath her bonnet. The store's bell chimed as she entered, the familiar scents of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeting her. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," called Frank Pearson from behind the counter, his smile genuine beneath his grey moustache. "Got those nails you asked about last week?" "Appreciate that, Mr. Pearson," Eleanor replied with measured warmth. "I'll need the usual supplies, plus extra coffee if you have it." As Frank gathered her items, Eleanor browsed the store with practiced nonchalance, ears attuned to the conversations around her. Mrs. Whitman and Sally Jenkins were discussing preparations for the Harvest Festival while examining fabric bolts. By the ammunition display, two ranch hands debated the merits of different caliber rounds for predator control. It was the hushed conversation near the post office corner that caught Eleanor's attention. Sheriff Collins, a man whose competence she'd come to respect despite his advanced age, was speaking with a trail-worn rider she didn't recognize. "Third farm this month," the stranger was saying. "Family barely got out of their lives. Reeves had them surrounded before dawn." "Sheriff." Collins shook his head, his weathered face grim. "How many in his gang now?" "At least 8 that I counted, all armed to the teeth and mean as rattlers." Eleanor maintained her browsing, giving no indication she was absorbing every word. Her mind immediately began calculating distances, likely approaches and potential vulnerabilities in her cabin's defenses. "Mrs. Blackwood," Frank's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "That'll be $2.35 for everything." Eleanor paid and exchanged pleasantries, keeping her expression calm despite the tactical assessments running through her mind. As Frank helped load her supplies onto Sadie, he hesitated. "Mrs. Blackwood, don't know if you've heard about the trouble moving through the territory." "I've caught wind of some concerns," she replied carefully. Frank lowered his voice. "These Reeves boys, they're targeting folks living out on their own. Maybe consider staying in town for a spell. Mrs. Harris has rooms available at the boarding house." Eleanor gave him a gentle smile that never reached her eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Pearson, but I've grown fond of my little place. Besides, I doubt Outlaws would bother with a widow who has little value." As she mounted Sadie and turned toward home, Eleanor was already making mental adjustments to her preparations. The gang would likely scout her property before making any move. They'd observe her patterns, look for weaknesses, count how many people lived there. Standard tactical approach for predators, human or otherwise. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the forested path as Eleanor approached her cabin. She slowed Sadie to a walk, her senses heightened. Nothing seemed disturbed, but years of experience had taught her to trust the prickling sensation along her spine. Someone had been watching the cabin. After stabling Sadie and unloading her supplies, Eleanor moved through her home with deliberate calm, checking each window and door. Near the north corner of her property, she spotted it, a broken branch that hadn't been damaged during her morning departure. Fresh boot prints pressed into the soft earth beneath the old oak, positioned perfectly to observe the cabin's daily routine. Eleanor allowed herself a grim smile as she bolted her door from the inside. They were coming. Perhaps not tonight, but soon. The Reeves gang had made the fatal mistake of selecting her cabin as their next target, assuming a solitary widow would be easy prey. As darkness fell, she moved methodically through her evening routine, lighting lamps that would be visible through the windows, creating the impression of an ordinary night. But beneath this performance of normalcy, Eleanor Blackwood was preparing for war, her movements carrying the quiet precision of a predator rather than prey. The shadow. Eleanor that she'd buried 3 years ago was awakening, and the men who would come hunting her had no idea they were about to become the hunted. The next 3 days passed with deceptive quietness in the forest surrounding Eleanor's cabin. To casual observers, her routine remained unchanged, tending her small garden at dawn, chopping wood mid-morning, hunting in the early afternoon. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, her every movement served a tactical purpose. Eleanor had spent these days reinforcing her defenses with subtle adjustments that would go unnoticed by watching eyes. She'd repositioned her woodpile to provide better cover near the west approach. The garden's newly installed trellis could now serve as a blind for the southern exposure. Extra water barrels, seemingly placed to catch rain, were strategically positioned to provide both cover and to extinguish any fire attempts. On the morning of the fourth day, Eleanor spotted fresh tracks along the creek bed, at least 3 different sets of boot prints where there should have been none. One set showed the distinctive wear pattern of cavalry boots, another the broad imprint of custom spurs. The third belonged to a man who favored his right leg, putting extra weight on his left foot. "Getting bolder," she murmured, crouching to examine the depth of the impressions. 2 days at most before they make their move. She followed the tracks until they disappeared into the rocky terrain leading toward the abandoned Harker mining claim 2 miles north. The perfect staging ground for men planning an attack. Eleanor returned to her cabin by an indirect route, using the skills that had once made her the Army's premier scout. She moved with the silence of a mountain lion, leaving no trace of her. Passage through the forest understory. Upon reaching her cabin, she immediately began final preparations. From beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, Eleanor retrieved a wooden box she hadn't opened since arriving in Pinecrest. Inside lay her past, official papers from General Grant himself, commendations for valor behind enemy lines, and a rare photograph showing a younger Eleanor in modified Union blues, standing beside 7 other women and 12 men of the Phantom Division. Her fingers traced the faces of her former squad before settling on a silver medal at the bottom of the box. The Shadow Cross, awarded for the Chattanooga operation that had ended the careers of 3 Confederate generals without firing a single shot. Only 12 had ever been awarded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor set these memories aside and reached deeper into the hidden compartment, pulling out a custom-made telescopic sight, a rare device crafted by a German gunsmith that could turn her Winchester into a precision instrument at distances that would seem impossible to most marksmen. Next came specialized ammunition she'd handcrafted years ago, each bullet precisely weighted and loaded for maximum accuracy. By midday, Eleanor had prepared each of her 5 firearms and positioned them at the ready near her specially modified windows. The Winchester and her husband's Army Colt would remain on her person. A Sharps rifle was positioned at the north window, a second Winchester at the east, and a shotgun loaded with custom scattershot by the front door. As she worked, Eleanor's mind mapped the likely approach vectors the Reeves gang would take. Based on their previous attacks, they preferred dawn raids, surrounding their targets under cover of early morning mist. They'd cut any escape routes first, then use intimidation before resorting to violence, not from mercy, but from pragmatic desire to avoid damaging valuable property. A flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line caught her attention. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor spotted a man slipping between pines, using their shadows for concealment. He was good, better than the average outlaw, but to her trained eye, his passage was as obvious as footprints in fresh snow. "Scout," she whispered, remaining perfectly still as she observed him through a small mirror positioned to allow surveillance without being directly visible from outside. The man was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build and careful movements of someone with military training. He spent nearly 40 minutes studying her cabin, making mental notes of doors, windows, and potential weaknesses. Eleanor watched him mark the location of her stable, the well, and the small cellar doors. He was mapping her vulnerabilities, creating a tactical assessment for the coming attack. When he finally retreated into the forest, she allowed herself a grim smile. He'd missed her most crucial defenses, the reinforced wall sections, the hidden firing ports, the carefully designed sightlines that would funnel attackers into predetermined zones. As afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor wrote 2 letters, by lamplight. The first, addressed to Sheriff Collins, contained detailed information about the Reeves gang, their patterns, and their connection to land speculators operating out of Denver. The second was more personal, addressed to Catherine Reynolds, her former second-in-command from the Phantom Division, now working as a Pinkerton detective in Chicago. "If I don't survive what's coming," she wrote, "finish what I've started. The evidence is hidden in the usual manner, third cipher." She signed it simply Shadow, a name she hadn't used in years. Eleanor sealed the letters and tucked them into a hidden compartment in her boot heel. If things went poorly, they would still reach their destinations. As darkness settled fully over the forest, Eleanor extinguished her lamps one by one, as though preparing for bed. Instead of sleeping, she moved silently through her cabin, checking each weapon, each position, each line of sight. She'd operated behind enemy lines for 3 years during the war. One night of vigilance was nothing in comparison. Around midnight, the whinny of a horse broke the silence. Not Sadie, but a strange mount being led quietly along the north ridge. Eleanor moved to her bedroom window, using a small pocket mirror to scan the tree line without exposing herself. Moonlight glinted off metal in the distance, a rifle barrel catching stray beams as someone moved into position. They were setting up earlier than expected, establishing a perimeter during the night to be ready for a dawn attack. Eleanor counted 3 shadows moving through the trees, positioning themselves at key points around her property. Their discipline suggested Jackson Reeves ran his gang with military precision, unusual for common outlaws, but consistent with reports that he'd served as a Confederate cavalry officer. Eleanor retreated from the window and moved to her kitchen table, where a rough map of her property lay. She marked the positions she'd identified, analyzing their tactical arrangement. Their current deployment left a gap to the southeast, either an oversight or deliberately left open to funnel her toward a waiting ambush if she attempted to flee. From a hidden drawer beneath her sink, Eleanor retrieved a pair of specialized items that had served her well during the war: tinted glasses designed to reduce dawn glare, and thin leather gloves with the fingertips removed for maximum dexterity. Next came a dark blue bandana that she folded and tied around her neck, ready to pull up over her nose and mouth when the time came. By 3 in the morning, Eleanor had detected 5 men positioned around her cabin. Based on the reports from town, that meant at least 3 more remained unaccounted for, likely including Jackson Reeves himself, who would coordinate the attack. Rather than take a perimeter position, outside, an owl called 3 times in quick succession. Not a natural pattern. A signal. Eleanor checked her weapons one final time, then settled into the chair by her front window, Winchester across her lap. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but she was ready. The hunters surrounding her cabin had no idea they were being hunted in return. The pre-dawn air carried a biting chill as Eleanor moved silently through her cabin, the first grey light barely filtering through the eastern windows. She detected movement along the perimeter, subtle shifts in position as the Reeves gang prepared for their coordinated approach. Their discipline was impressive. Most outlaw gangs she'd encountered lacked such precision. Eleanor paused at each window, using her small mirror to check positions without exposing herself. The gang had maintained excellent discipline through the night, holding their stations despite the cold. A mark of strong leadership, confirming what she'd heard about Jackson Reeves. The former cavalry lieutenant had brought military tactics to his criminal enterprise, making his gang far more dangerous than common bandits. The soft whicker of horses reached her ears, new arrivals positioning themselves to the west of the cabin. Through her mirror, Eleanor caught glimpses of 3 riders dismounting among the pines, their movements confident and unhurried. One man stood taller than the others, his broad-shouldered silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. Jackson. Reeves had arrived to personally oversee what he presumed would be an easy conquest. Eleanor checked her timepiece, 5:43 a.m. Dawn proper was minutes away. They would make their move soon, using the transitional light to their advantage. She moved to her predetermined position by the north window, where the specialized rifle rest built into the window frame would stabilize her first crucial shots. At precisely 5:50 a.m., a bird call sounded from the east edge of the clearing, a poor imitation of a mountain bluebird. Signals rippled around the perimeter, another call from the south, then movement to the west as the gang began their coordinated approach. Eleanor remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing as she'd been trained. 8 men were now visible, through her carefully positioned mirrors, moving toward her cabin with weapons drawn. 4 approached from the front, while others circled to cover potential escape routes. Their formation was textbook military, clearly designed to intimidate and overwhelm a lone homesteader. The front door rattled suddenly with 3 sharp knocks. "Mrs. Blackwood," called a deep voice, its forced politeness thinly veiling menace. "Got some trouble with my horse. Wondering if I might trouble you for some water." Eleanor remained silent, watching through her mirror as the men exchanged glances. This was their standard opening, a false request for assistance to determine if the occupant was awake and how many people might be inside. "Ma'am?" The voice came again, harder now. "I can hear you moving around in there. Just need a moment." "Of your time." When no response came, she heard hushed conferring on her porch. Through her mirror, she watched Jackson Reeves nod to the men flanking her door. One moved to peer through the front window, while another positioned himself by the rear entrance. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood," Reeves called, dropping all pretense of politeness. "We know you're alone in there. This can go easy or hard, but either way, we'll be coming inside to discuss the future of this property." Eleanor adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she had clear sightlines to each approach. She'd faced worse odds during the Atlanta operation. In '64, when she'd been outnumbered 12-1 behind Confederate lines, the door handle turned as someone tested its resistance. Finding it locked, there was a moment of silence before a new voice spoke, younger with an edge of impatience. "Kick it in, Wyatt. Old woman's probably hiding under her bed." "Wait," ordered Reeves, his voice carrying the natural authority of command. "Mrs. Blackwood, you have 1 minute to open this door before we open it for you. I'd hate to damage such a fine piece of craftsmanship." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, carrying easily through the door. "Mr. Reeves, I presume. I've been expecting you since your scout examined my property yesterday afternoon." A moment of stunned silence followed her words. Eleanor could almost picture the looks exchanged on her porch. "You have me at a disadvantage, ma'am," Reeves replied, caution now evident in his tone. "Don't believe we've been properly introduced. No formal introduction needed when you've been tracking a man's movements for weeks," Eleanor responded, shifting slightly to keep all approaches in her view. 5 attacks on homesteads across 2 territories, always isolated properties, always at dawn, always with the same patterns. More murmuring outside, now with an undercurrent of unease, Eleanor continued before Reeves could respond. "You and your men are trespassing on private property, Mr. Reeves. I'll give you the courtesy you didn't extend to the Hanson family or the Wilkinsons. Leave now, and we'll have no quarrel." Through her mirror, Eleanor watched Reeves's face harden. The brief flash of uncertainty replaced by anger. His hand moved to signal his men, who began spreading wider around the cabin. "Impressive research for a widow living alone in the wilderness," he called, his voice regaining its confidence. "But knowing who we are won't change what's happening here. This land is worth a great deal to certain interests in Denver. You can leave with your personal belongings and a fair payment, or you can leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. Those are your only options." Eleanor noted the positions of all 8 men now, 4 covering the main approaches to the cabin. Two by the stable, one near her garden, and Reeves himself on the porch. Each man carried a rifle or shotgun, with sidearms visible on their hips. Their positioning was professional, leaving no obvious escape route. "There's always another option, Mr. Reeves," Eleanor replied calmly. "And what might that be?" he asked, a hint of mockery entering his voice. "You could discover that you've made a grave tactical error in your assessment of this situation." Her words hung in the morning air for a moment before Reeves laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. 8 armed men against 1 woman. I'd say our assessment is sound." Eleanor's finger moved to the trigger of her Winchester. "Numbers mean little when positions are compromised. Your man by the stable is standing on unstable ground. The one by my garden has poor cover and worse sight lines. The 2 approaching from the south have placed themselves in a potential crossfire. And you, Mr. Reeves, are silhouetted perfectly against the eastern sky." Another silence, heavier than before. Through her mirror, Eleanor watched Reeves' expression shift from confidence to wary reassessment. His eyes scanned the cabin's exterior with new attention, noting details he'd previously overlooked: the unusual angle of the window frames, the reinforced shutters, the absence of standard vulnerabilities. "You talk like a military man, Mrs. Blackwood," he said finally, his voice quieter but carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Observant," Eleanor replied, "but incomplete. Now I'll ask once more. Remove yourself and your men from my property." Reeves straightened, squaring his shoulders as he made his decision. "Can't do that, Ma'am. Too much at stake. But I admire your spirit. It'll serve you well in finding a new place to settle." He signaled to his men with a sharp gesture. "Wyatt, Davies, secure the entrance." 2 men moved toward the door, one raising a boot to kick it open. Eleanor sighted down her Winchester and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the morning stillness with precision, striking the door frame inches from the lead man's hand, close enough to send splinters into his skin, but carefully placed to avoid lethal damage. The man jerked backward with a startled cry as his companions dove for cover. Within seconds, all 8 outlaws had scattered, taking positions behind trees, the water trough, and the woodpile. "That," Eleanor called into the ensuing silence, "was your only warning shot." From his position behind an oak tree, Reeves barked orders to his men, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Keep her pinned down. Wyatt, circle around back. Torres, cover the north window." The outlaws began firing at the cabin, bullets thudding into the sturdy logs or whistling through windows. What they didn't realize was that Eleanor had anticipated exactly this response. Each window was positioned to appear vulnerable, while actually providing her with protected firing angles. As the first volley subsided, Eleanor moved swiftly to her next position, readying herself for the real confrontation that was just beginning. Bullets peppered the cabin's exterior as Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency between her prepared positions. She counted shots methodically, essential information about the weapons she faced. The man behind the oak tree was using a Spencer repeating rifle, 7 rounds before reloading. The outlaw by the water trough carried a Winchester similar to her own. 2 others wielded shotguns, effective at close range but useless beyond 30 yards. None of the gang members had expected serious resistance. Their shooting was hasty, uncoordinated, despite their initial disciplined approach. Eleanor used their confusion to her advantage, mentally mapping each man's position while remaining invisible behind her reinforced walls. From the back of the cabin came the sound of breaking glass, someone attempting to enter through the kitchen window. Eleanor had anticipated this move, having deliberately left that window unshuttered to create an apparent vulnerability. What the intruder didn't know was that the floor beneath that window had been specially modified. A sudden crash followed. By a pained curse confirmed her trap had worked. The weakened floorboards had given way, dropping the unwelcome visitor several feet into the shallow pit she dug and concealed beneath her kitchen floor. "Wyatt's down," came a shout from outside. "Something's wrong with the floor." Eleanor took advantage of the momentary distraction. In one fluid motion, she moved to the north window, using the specialized rifle rest she'd built into the frame. Through her custom sight, she located the man who'd been edging toward her stable. The distance was approximately 80 yards, a challenging shot for most, but well within her capabilities. She exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked, and the outlaw by the stable dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder as he fell back against the structure. The shot had been precisely placed to disable without killing, a skill few possessed. "She got Ellis," another voice called out, tension evident in the tone. From behind the oak, Jackson Reeves barked new orders. "Hold positions. Davies, get Wyatt. Out of there, Carter, circle wide to the east. Torres, lay down covering fire." Eleanor moved immediately to her next position, anticipating their adjustment. The outlaw called Torres began firing steadily at the north window where she'd just been, allowing his companion to begin a flanking maneuver around the eastern approach to the cabin. "You're no ordinary widow, Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves called out during a lull in the firing. "That shoulder shot was military precision." Eleanor remained silent, tracking the movement of the man attempting to flank her position. He was good, using the natural contours of the land for cover, moving only when Torres provided covering fire, but he hadn't noticed the thin wire stretched between two pine saplings at ankle height, another of Eleanor's carefully placed preparations. Sure enough, as the outlaw reached the wire, he stumbled forward with a startled cry. The noise was minimal, but to Eleanor's trained ear, it provided the exact location she needed. She moved to the eastern window, using a different angle than the flanking outlaw would expect. Through a narrow gap in the shutters, too small to provide a target but sufficient for her to sight through, she located the fallen man, scrambling for cover. Eleanor chambered another round and fired. The bullet struck the ground inches from the outlaw's hand, sending dirt and pine needles into his face. The message was clear. She could have hit him if she'd wanted to. "Your man to the east should stay down, Mr. Reeves," Eleanor called out. Calmly, "His position is compromised." A tense silence followed her words. Eleanor used the moment to check on the outlaw trapped beneath her kitchen floor. Through a small observation port she'd built into the kitchen cabinet, she could see a young man, perhaps 20, nursing a bruised leg and looking thoroughly confused about his predicament. "What kind of woman are you?" he muttered, not realizing. She could hear him. Outside, Reeves was reassessing the situation. Eleanor watched through her system of mirrors as he conferred quietly with one of his men. Their body language revealed growing frustration and uncertainty. This wasn't proceeding according to their plan. "Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves called again, his voice carrying a new edge of forced reasonableness. "It seems we've underestimated you. Perhaps we can discuss terms after all." "Nothing to discuss," Eleanor replied, moving to yet another firing position. "Me terms remain the same. Leave my property immediately." She watched Reeves shake his head, his expression hardening. He signaled to the men nearest him, issuing new instructions in hushed tones. Eleanor noted how they began shifting positions, creating a more distributed perimeter around the cabin. They were settling in for a longer confrontation, a concerning development. One of the outlaws produced a canteen and took a long drink before passing it to his companion. Another checked his ammunition supply, indicating they were prepared to wait her out. Siege tactics, another sign of Reeves' military background. Eleanor considered her options. Her supplies would last weeks if necessary, but allowing the situation to devolve into a prolonged standoff would bring unwanted attention from Pinecrest. She needed to resolve this quickly, on her terms. From her vantage point, Eleanor watched as two of Reeves' men began gathering branches and kindling. Their intentions became clear. They were preparing to attempt setting fire to the cabin, a common tactic against fortified positions. "Fire won't work, Mr. Reeves," she called out. "The roof has been treated with a solution of alum and clay. The walls, too. It's an old army technique for frontier outposts." Through her mirror, she caught the brief flash of surprise on Reeves's face before he masked it. "You seem to know a lot about military tactics for a homesteader, Mrs. Blackwood, and you employ cavalry flanking maneuvers with surprising precision for an outlaw, Lieutenant Reeves," Eleanor replied, deliberately using his former military rank. "12th Virginia Cavalry under Colonel Asher Harmon, if I'm not mistaken. Distinguished service at Brandy Station." A profound silence followed her words. Eleanor could almost feel the shock rippling through the outlaws surrounding her cabin. How could this isolated widow know such specific details about their leader's past? "Who are you?" Reeves demanded, genuine uncertainty now evident in his voice. Eleanor moved to another window, this one providing a clear view of Reeves' position behind the oak tree. Through her specialized sight, she could see the confusion on his face, the recalculation happening behind his eyes. "Someone who recognizes cavalry deployment patterns," she answered. "Someone who knows that your current position leaves your men vulnerable to enfilade fire from my east and north windows simultaneously." To demonstrate her point, Eleanor fired 2 shots in rapid succession. The first splintered a branch above Torres's head, sending him diving for better cover. The second struck the ground between 2 outlaws attempting to assemble fire materials, scattering their kindling. "That's twice I've chosen not to hit your men directly," Eleanor noted calmly. "There won't be a third time." Inside the pit beneath, her kitchen floor, the young outlaw had gone very still, listening to the exchange with growing apprehension. Eleanor heard him mutter a prayer under his breath. Outside, Reeves gestured for his men to hold their fire, his expression tense as he reassessed the situation. Through her mirror, Eleanor watched him studying the cabin with new eyes, noting details he'd overlooked before, the precise positioning of each window, the slightly unusual pitch of the roof designed to eliminate blind spots, the carefully maintained clear areas that provided unobstructed firing lanes in all directions. "You've turned this entire cabin into a defensive position," he said finally, realization evident in his tone. "Every window, every approach." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, simply. "And I've had 3 years to perfect it." A new wariness entered Reeves's expression. His next words came more carefully, respect mingling with caution. "You still haven't answered my question, Mrs. Blackwood. Who are you, really?" Eleanor shifted position again, maintaining her tactical advantage while keeping all approaches in view. The moment had come to change the dynamic of this confrontation. During the war, the Union Army had a special division that operated behind Confederate lines, she stated, her voice carrying clearly to all the outlaws surrounding her cabin. Small teams, specialized training, focused on high-value targets, and intelligence gathering. They called us the Phantoms. Eleanor's revelation about the Phantom Division hung in the morning air, transforming the atmosphere of the confrontation. Through her network of mirrors, she watched understanding dawn across Jackson Reeves's face, the recognition of a predator, realizing he'd stumbled into the territory of a more dangerous hunter. "The Phantoms were a myth," one of the outlaws called out, uncertainty evident in his voice. "Stories made up to scare Confederate scouts." "That's what we wanted everyone to believe," Eleanor replied, her tone matter-of-fact as she maintained vigilance on all approaches. 12 men and 8 women operating in teams of 2 or 3. We moved through enemy territory, gathering intelligence, eliminating strategic targets, and disrupting supply lines. She shifted position again, using the specialized handholds she'd built into her cabin walls to move silently between firing ports. This constant movement was a technique she'd perfected during urban operations in Richmond, never staying in one location long enough to be targeted. 8 women, Reeves questioned, disbelief coloring his tone despite his growing unease. The Union Army didn't allow— The Union Army officially didn't, Eleanor interrupted. Unofficially, General Grant recognized that women could move through Southern territory with less suspicion. We posed as widows, laundresses, nurses, invisible until we chose not to be. From his position behind the oak tree, Reeves gestured subtly to his men. Eleanor noted how they began adjusting their stances, preparing for a coordinated rush on her signal, a common cavalry tactic when facing an entrenched position. "Your men should reconsider their next move carefully," Eleanor warned, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. The east and south approaches are covered by tripwires connected to alarm systems. The western approach has pressure-sensitive plates beneath the soil that will alert me to any movement. To demonstrate her awareness, Eleanor fired a precise shot that kicked up dirt just inches from a concealed pressure plate one of the outlaws had been approaching. The man froze, his expression a mixture of shock and newfound fear. Inside the pit beneath her kitchen floor, the young outlaw had begun examining his surroundings more carefully. "This ain't just a root cellar," he muttered, running his fingers along the precisely joined wooden supports. "This is a holding cell." "Correct, Mr. Wyatt," Eleanor called down through the observation port, startling him. "Designed to temporarily contain intruders without causing permanent harm. The war taught me that killing should always be a last resort." Outside, Reeves had gone silent, reassessing the situation with the calculated precision that had once made him an effective cavalry officer. Eleanor watched him studying the cabin with new eyes, mentally mapping firing angles and defensive positions. "If you're who you claim to be," he finally, "you have a name, a designation that others would recognize." Eleanor paused, considering the implications of acknowledging her former identity. For 3 years, she'd buried that part of herself, becoming simply Eleanor Blackwood, widow and homesteader. Reclaiming her wartime designation meant accepting that her peaceful interlude had ended. "They called me Shadow Eleanor," she answered, her voice steady. "Lead scout and precision shooter for the Phantom Division's Western operations, specializing in long-range eliminations and intelligence gathering behind enemy lines." The effect of her words was immediate. 2 of the outlaws exchanged startled glances, recognition flashing across their features. One, a man with a pronounced limp who'd been maintaining position by the water trough, actually lowered his weapon slightly. "Shadow Eleanor is dead," he stated, though uncertainty had entered his voice. "Killed during operations near Atlanta, in '64. "That's what the official reports say, Mr. Davies," Eleanor replied, deliberately using his name to unsettle him further. "The same reports that claimed Lieutenant Jackson Reeves died at Petersburg, rather than deserting to form a criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable homesteaders." She shifted again, moving to the specialized firing port she'd constructed in her chimney, an unconventional position that provided coverage of the entire northern approach. Through her network of mirrors, she watched confusion spread among the outlaws. Men who had entered this confrontation, confident in their numerical superiority, were now questioning everything about the situation. "Your reputation preceded you, if you truly are Shadow Eleanor," Reeves acknowledged, his voice carrying a new note of professional respect beneath the tension. 28 confirmed eliminations, all from distances our sharpshooters considered impossible. They said you could hit a man's pocket watch at 500 yards. 473, Eleanor corrected calmly. The stories grew with each telling, but accurate enough for your current circumstances to be concerning. From his position behind the woodpile, Torres, the man Eleanor had identified as having military training earlier, began inching backward, clearly reassessing his exposure. Eleanor allowed this retreat, knowing that creating division among the outlaws would work to her advantage. "I don't care what fancy title she had during the war," snarled another outlaw, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard who'd been maintaining position behind a large boulder. "She's still just one woman against 8 men. I say we rush her from all sides. She can't cover everything at once." "She doesn't need to, Carter," Reeves responded sharply. "She only needs to hit the first 2 or 3 men who break cover. Are you volunteering to lead that charge?" Carter fell silent, his bravado diminishing under his leader's pointed question. Inside the pit beneath the kitchen, young Wyatt had begun examining the construction more carefully. "This wood ain't from around here," he observed aloud. "It's southern pine, not the local timber." "Perceptive?" Eleanor noted through the observation port. "The supports are from a Confederate supply wagon we captured near Chattanooga. I've found that items taken during the war make for excellent building materials in peacetime, a kind of poetic justice." Outside, Reeves had begun a careful visual survey of the entire property, his experienced eye detecting details he'd missed. In his initial assessment, the subtle berms that provided Eleanor with protected lanes of fire, the carefully trimmed branches that eliminated potential cover for attackers, the reinforced shutters designed to withstand concentrated fire. "You've spent 3 years creating a fortress disguised as a homestead," he observed, genuine admiration coloring his tone despite the circumstances. "Every detail calculated, every approach covered." 2 years and 7 months, to be precise. Eleanor corrected. The first 5 months were spent surveying the territory and selecting the optimal location. This ridge offers commanding views, defensible approaches, and multiple escape routes if necessary. The sun had risen fully now, illuminating the standoff in clear morning light. Eleanor noted how the outlaws had settled into more cautious positions, their initial confidence replaced by wary respect. Through her mirrors, she watched Reeves conferring quietly with Davies, the man who had recognized her wartime designation. "Tell me something, Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves called out after a moment. "If you truly are Shadow Eleanor, why here? Why exchange a legendary military career for isolation in the wilderness?" The question carried genuine curiosity beneath its tactical purpose of keeping her talking. Eleanor considered her response carefully, aware that personal information could be both a connection and a vulnerability. "The same reason many soldiers sought the frontier after the war, Lieutenant Reeves," she replied, "to build something rather than destroy, to find peace after years of violence." She paused, then added, "Though as you've demonstrated today, peace isn't guaranteed even in the most remote locations." Through her mirrors, Eleanor caught the brief flash of something like regret cross Reeves's features before his expression hardened again into tactical assessment. "Our employer doesn't care about your past, Mrs. Blackwood," he stated flatly, "only about this land and its strategic value for the coming railroad. His offer remains: vacate voluntarily with compensation, or be removed by force." "And who exactly is this employer so interested in my modest homestead?" Eleanor questioned, though she already had strong suspicions based on her research. Reeves hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "A gentleman with significant investments in the Denver and Rio Grande, a man with political connections who ensures his operations proceed without interference." "Sebastian Montgomery," Eleanor supplied, watching satisfaction flash across Reeves's face at her accurate deduction. "Railroad magnate, land speculator, and suspected architect of the mysterious accidents befalling those who obstruct his planned route through the territory." She shifted position again, moving to her western window to maintain coverage of all approaches. "What Montgomery hasn't told you, Lieutenant, is that his claim to these lands rests on forged documents. Papers my late husband exposed before his accidental death 3 years ago. The revelation landed like a physical blow among the outlaws. Eleanor watched several exchange uneasy glances, their loyalty visibly wavering as they processed this new information. "James Blackwood wasn't just my husband," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the pain of these memories. He was a federal land agent investigating corruption in territorial acquisitions. His reports to Washington detailed Montgomery's entire operation, the bribes, the forgeries, the strategic violence against homesteaders who refused to sell. She paused, letting her words sink in. Those reports disappeared the day after James was found with a broken neck at the bottom of a ravine. A riding accident, according to the coroner, Montgomery had in his pocket. Eleanor's revelation about her husband's death and Sebastian Montgomery's corrupt land dealings hung in the morning air, transforming the standoff once again. Through her strategic observation points, she watched the impact of her words ripple through the outlaws surrounding her cabin. Davies, the limping man who had recognized her military designation earlier, lowered his weapon completely. "Montgomery told us this was legal acquisition," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the property. "Said he had proper papers from the territorial office." "Montgomery has been fabricating legal claims throughout the territory," Eleanor responded, maintaining her vigilance on all approaches. "Using his political connections to have them registered without scrutiny. My husband discovered the pattern and began building a case against him." From his position behind the oak tree, Reeves remained silent, his expression unreadable. Eleanor could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the reassessment of his position, his options, and most importantly, his loyalties. "You have no proof of these allegations," he finally called out, though there was a new hesitation in his voice. "The proof is in my possession," Eleanor replied calmly. "Copies of the original land grants, documentation of the forgeries, testimonies from territorial officials who were pressured into cooperation. All carefully preserved and distributed to trusted contacts who will release them in the event of my death." She shifted position again, moving to cover the southern approach where two outlaws had been whispering urgently to each other. Their body language suggested growing uncertainty about their mission. "Montgomery's paying us good money," the heavy-set outlaw named Carter growled, though his words seemed directed more at his wavering companions than at Eleanor. "It doesn't matter the details as long as the gold spends. It matters when hanging." "Judges don't distinguish between hired guns and their employers," Eleanor countered. "Montgomery remains safely in Denver, while you risk your necks carrying out his dirty work. When investigations begin, he'll deny all knowledge of your actions." This struck home with several of the men. Eleanor noted how Torres, the former military man, had moved further back from his original position, clearly reconsidering his involvement. "Why should we believe you over our employer?" Reeves challenged, though Eleanor detected genuine uncertainty beneath his defiant tone. "Because unlike Montgomery, I'm willing to show you the evidence," she responded. "Documents that prove he's been systematically defrauding homesteaders and the federal government. Evidence that would implicate anyone associated with his operations." Eleanor moved to another firing position, maintaining her tactical advantage while continuing the psychological dismantling of Reeves' team. "Some of you fought in the war," she noted, her voice steady. "You followed orders from men you trusted, for causes you believed in. What cause are you serving now, beyond lining Montgomery's pockets?" In the pit beneath her kitchen floor, young Wyatt had gone very still, absorbing every word of the exchange above him. Eleanor heard him murmur something that sounded like, "new." This job didn't feel right. Outside, Davies had begun limping away from his position toward Reeves, clearly intent on conferring with his leader. Eleanor allowed this movement, recognizing that fractures were forming within the outlaw ranks. "Montgomery didn't just target my husband," she continued, pressing her psychological advantage. "The accidents that befell the Hanson family and the Wilkinsons followed the same pattern. Suspicious deaths after they refused to sell their land for his proposed railroad route." She paused, letting this sink in. How many of you signed on to become murderers of innocent families? How many would willingly hang for a man who sees you as disposable tools? The impact of her words was visible in how several outlaws shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. Through her mirrors, Eleanor watched as Torres actually stepped fully away from the conflict, moving back toward where the horses were tethered. "Where do you think you're going, Torres?" Carter called out angrily. "Rethinking my position," Torres replied evenly. "The lieutenant knows I didn't sign up for targeting federal agents or their families. That crosses a line." Reeves had finished his hushed conversation with Davies, his expression grave as he assessed his rapidly disintegrating operation. Through her specialized sighting equipment, Eleanor could see the struggle playing out across his features. The military officer's sense of duty warring with the outlaw leader's pragmatism. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called finally, his voice carrying a new note of formal respect, "I propose a temporary ceasefire to discuss terms." "My terms remain unchanged," Eleanor replied steadily. "You and your men leave my property immediately." "With newly acquired information, the parameters of our engagement have shifted," Reeves responded, falling back on formal military language. "I request 10 minutes of discussion to reassess our respective positions." Eleanor considered his request carefully, weighing the tactical advantages and risks. A brief negotiation period would allow her to conserve ammunition and potentially divide the gang further, but it also created opportunities for deception. 5 minutes, she countered. "Your men maintain their current positions. Any attempt to advance will be met with immediate response." Reeves nodded his agreement, then turned to confer with Davies and the outlaw nearest his position. Through her observation network, Eleanor noted how the gang had effectively split into 3 factions: those still loyal to Reeves, those who were wavering, and Torres, who had clearly decided to abandon the operation. From the holding pit beneath her, "Kitchen," Wyatt called up tentatively. "Ma'am, if what you're saying is true about Montgomery, I want no part in this. I signed on for pressuring reluctant sellers, not what happened to your husband." Eleanor studied the young man through her observation port. His expression seemed genuinely troubled, though she remained wary of deception. "Your concern comes rather late, Mr. Wyatt," she noted coolly. "Didn't know the details before," he insisted. "Montgomery's man in Denver just said we were helping acquire necessary properties for the railroad. Progress for the territory, he called it." Outside, the discussion among the outlaws had grown more heated. Carter was gesturing emphatically, while Reeves maintained a calm, controlled demeanor. 2 of the men had moved closer to Torres near the horses, clearly considering following his example. "You said you have proof," Reeves called to Eleanor after several minutes of intense deliberation. "What exactly do you possess that would implicate Montgomery?" "My husband was meticulous in his investigations," Eleanor responded. "He compiled ledgers tracking suspicious land transactions, collected samples of forged documents alongside the originals for comparison, and recorded testimonies from territorial officials who were pressured into cooperation." She paused, then added the most damning evidence. "He also maintained correspondence with Judge Carlton in Denver, communications that detailed his suspicions and named Montgomery directly as the architect of the fraudulent schemes." This new information landed heavily among the outlaws. Judge Carlton was well known throughout the territory as an incorruptible federal judge who had sent more than one wealthy man to prison despite political connections. "If Carlton was involved, why hasn't Montgomery been arrested?" challenged Carter, though uncertainty had crept into his belligerent tone. "Because the final piece of evidence disappeared the day my husband died," Eleanor explained. "A document bearing Montgomery's signature on instructions for land acquisition by any means necessary. Without it, there wasn't enough for formal charges." She shifted position again, maintaining her tactical advantage while pressing her psychological. "Offensive. That document is now in my possession, recovered from the man Montgomery sent to remove it from my husband's effects. This was a calculated risk. The document existed, but Eleanor couldn't be certain Montgomery had personally signed it, rather than using an intermediary. However, the impact of her claim on the Outlaws was immediate and dramatic. Torres immediately mounted his horse. "I'm done," he announced clearly. "This has gone beyond what I agreed to. Anyone with sense should do the same." Carter raised his rifle, aiming at the departing man. "You don't walk away from a job, Torres." "Lower your weapon, Carter," Reeves ordered sharply. "Killing our own men isn't part of any operation I command." The tension among the Outlaws had reached a breaking point. Eleanor watched through her mirrors as clear divisions formed. Torres, already departing, 2 more men moving uncertainly toward their horses. Davies standing firmly beside Reeves, and Carter with 2 others maintaining aggressive postures. "Our 5 minutes of negotiation has concluded, Lieutenant Reeves," Eleanor called out. "What's your decision?" The morning sun climbed higher as Jackson Reeves faced the most challenging tactical decision of his post-war career. Eleanor watched through her observation system as the former lieutenant weighed his increasingly limited options. His operation had unraveled with unexpected speed. Torres already riding away, 2 more men edging toward their horses, and the remaining Outlaws divided in their loyalties. "Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves called finally, his voice carrying the resigned tone of a military commander recognizing an untenable position. "I propose terms for our disengagement." "I'm listening," Eleanor replied cautiously, maintaining her vigilance. On all approaches, years of experience had taught her that desperate men were often at their most dangerous when cornered. "My men and I will withdraw from your property immediately," Reeves stated. "In exchange, you provide us copies of the evidence against Montgomery, insurance for our own protection once he discovers we've failed to secure your land." Eleanor considered his proposal carefully. Providing documentary evidence would give the Outlaws leverage against their employer, potentially protecting them from reprisal. It would also implicate them further in the corruption she sought to expose. "Half now, half delivered to Sheriff Collins in Pinecrest once I've confirmed your complete withdrawal from the territory," she countered. "I'll include sworn statements identifying Montgomery as the architect of these operations, not the men following his orders." Before Reeves could respond, Carter stepped forward from his position, fury evident in his stance. "This is ridiculous. We don't negotiate with targets. Montgomery's paying us to clear this land, not to run at the first sign of resistance." "Stand down, Carter," Reeves ordered sharply. "The tactical situation has changed." "Nothing's changed. Except your backbone," Carter snarled, gesturing toward the cabin. "It's still 1 woman against 6 men. I don't care what fancy title she had during the war. She can't cover all angles at once." Eleanor had been anticipating this fracture. Through her mirrors, she watched the remaining Outlaws instinctively take sides, 2 moving closer to Carter, while Davies remained firmly beside Reeves. "You're welcome to test that theory, Mr. Carter," Eleanor called calmly. "But before you do, you should know that I've documented each of your faces and names, connecting you directly to Montgomery's operations. That information has already been dispatched to Judge Carlton in Denver." She paused, then added the detail she'd been holding in reserve. "I've also taken the liberty of documenting your involvement in the incident at the Hanson homestead, particularly your role in setting fire to their barn while the family was still inside." Carter's face paled visibly, his bravado faltering as he realized the extent of Eleanor's intelligence gathering. "You can't prove a distinctive spur pattern in the mud beside the Hansons' barn," Eleanor interrupted, "matching the custom spurs you're wearing right now. The same pattern was documented by the territorial marshal who investigated the scene but was later pressured to abandon the case." The precision of this detail landed like a physical blow. Eleanor watched uncertainty flash across Carter's face, quickly replaced by desperate calculation. She recognized the signs of a man considering his rapidly diminishing options and the dangerous unpredictability that accompanied such a moment. "Mrs. Blackwood's terms are acceptable," Reeves announced, firmly, reasserting his authority over the fractured group. "We withdraw completely in exchange for the documentation she's offered." "Speak for yourself, Lieutenant," Carter growled, using Reeves's former rank mockingly. "Some of us still honor our contracts." With a sudden motion, Carter raised his rifle and fired at the cabin's front window. The bullet splintered the wooden frame as Eleanor ducked smoothly below the sill, having anticipated this reaction. "Carter, stand down!" Reeves shouted, but the situation had already escalated beyond his control. Taking Carter's shot as a signal, his two allies opened fire on the cabin as well, forcing Reeves and Davies to dive for cover to avoid being caught in the crossfire. The unified operation had dissolved into chaos, exactly as Eleanor had calculated. From her protected position, Eleanor sighted carefully through a narrow gap in the shutters. Carter was directing his men to spread out, attempting to create multiple angles of fire on the cabin. It was a sound, tactical approach against a conventional opponent, but Eleanor had designed her defenses specifically to counter such strategies. She fired a precise shot that struck the ground between Carter's feet, forcing him back behind the water trough. "That was your final warning, Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice steady despite the escalating violence. "The next one won't miss." In the confusion, the two wavering outlaws had made their decision, mounting their horses and following Torres' earlier departure. This left only Carter and his two allies actively engaged against the cabin, with Reeves and Davies caught in an increasingly precarious neutral position. Inside the pit beneath her kitchen, young Wyatt called up anxiously, "Mrs. Blackwood, I want no part in Carter's foolishness. If you let me out, I swear I'll ride straight out of the territory." Eleanor assessed the young man's sincerity through her observation port. His fear appeared genuine, as did his desire to distance himself from the escalating conflict. "There's a release lever on the eastern support beam," she instructed him. "Pull it once, then move to the corner nearest the stove." Wyatt quickly located the mechanism and activated it. A section of the kitchen floor hinged downward, creating a ramp leading to a narrow tunnel that emerged behind the stable, an escape route Eleanor had engineered during her second year of residence. "Follow the tunnel," she directed. "It will lead you behind your horses. Take the chestnut mare with the white blaze. She's fast but gentle. Ride south toward Pinecrest and turn yourself into Sheriff Collins. Tell him everything about Montgomery's operation." "Yes, ma'am," Wyatt agreed hastily, already scrambling toward the tunnel entrance. "Thank you for the chance." Outside, Carter had organized his remaining allies into a more coordinated assault. One man had worked his way toward the woodpile on the western approach, while the other maintained covering fire from behind a large boulder. Carter himself was attempting to maneuver toward the blind spot near the chimney, a vulnerability Eleanor had deliberately crafted to appear more significant than it actually was. Through her network of mirrors, Eleanor observed Reeves and Davies, engaged in urgent discussion while maintaining cover from the ongoing gunfire. The former lieutenant's expression showed the calculating assessment of a trained officer evaluating a chaotic battlefield. Eleanor moved to her next firing position, preparing to counter Carter's advance. The outlaw had reached the corner of the cabin, where the chimney created an apparent dead zone in her fields of fire. What he didn't realize was that Eleanor had installed a specialized firing port in the chimney itself, concealed behind a removable brick. She detected movement outside. "This port," Carter edging closer, believing himself protected from her observation. Eleanor removed the brick silently and peered through the narrow opening, Carter was less than 10 feet away, his attention focused on the cabin's windows rather than the chimney itself. "I wouldn't take another step if I were you, Mr. Carter," Eleanor called calmly through the port. Carter froze, shock evident in his posture as he realized his supposedly safe approach had been anticipated. Before he could react, Eleanor fired a precise shot that splintered the stock of his rifle, rendering the weapon useless without injuring the man himself. Carter stumbled backward, cursing as he drew his sidearm. Eleanor had already moved to another position, maintaining her tactical advantage through constant mobility. From her new vantage point, she spotted one of Carter's allies attempting to circle behind the stable, likely hoping to use it as cover for approaching the rear of the cabin. Eleanor fired again, the bullet striking a metal bucket hanging beside the stable door. The loud clang startled the outlaw's horse, which reared suddenly, throwing the man to the ground and effectively neutralizing his advance. "Your men are exposed, Mr. Carter," Eleanor called out, "and your position is compromised." From their protected location behind the oak tree, Reeves finally made his decision. "Carter," he shouted, "this operation is terminated. Stand down immediately." "This operation is finished," Reeves repeated, his voice carrying the unmistakable command tone of a military officer. "Stand down, Carter," Carter responded with a string of profanities, his face contorted with rage as he took cover behind the water trough once more. "You've gone soft, Lieutenant," he spat. "Montgomery's paying us good money to clear this land, and I aim to earn my share." Through her observation network, Eleanor watched the final disintegration of what had once been a coordinated assault. The two men still following Carter had taken up positions that isolated them from Reeves and Davies, effectively creating two separate factions in what had begun as a unified operation. "Think, Carter," Reeves urged, maintaining his position behind the oak tree. "The woman has outmaneuvered us at every turn. She's documented our operations, connected us to Montgomery, and prepared this entire property as a defensive position. We're fighting on ground of her choosing against an opponent with superior tactical awareness." Eleanor used this moment of distraction to relocate to yet another firing position. Her system of concealed handholds and reinforced paths allowed her to move silently throughout the cabin's interior, appearing at different windows to maintain the impression of multiple defenders. Carter signaled to his remaining allies, directing one toward the eastern approach, while the other maintained covering fire. It was a basic flanking maneuver, but executed with the desperation of a man who knew his options were rapidly diminishing. "Your men are still exposed, Mr. Carter," Eleanor called calmly, "and now divided. Do you really want to risk their lives for a man who would deny all knowledge of your actions if captured?" To emphasize her point, Eleanor fired a precise shot that ricocheted off a metal feeding trough near one of Carter's men, sending him scrambling for better cover. The shot demonstrated both her accuracy and her continued choice to disable rather than kill, a psychological tactic that further undermined the outlaw's resolve. From his position behind the oak tree, Reeves had begun executing a different strategy. Eleanor observed him removing his gun belt and raising his hands slightly, signaling his intention to approach under truce. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called out. "Request permission to approach under white flag to discuss terms of full withdrawal." Eleanor considered his proposal carefully. Years of experience had taught her to be wary of such offers, particularly when other hostile forces remained active. However, Reeves's military background suggested he would respect the protocols of parley. "Permission. Granted, Lieutenant Reeves," she responded. "Advance slowly with Davies. Any attempt to use this approach as cover for hostile action will be met with immediate response." As Reeves and Davies began their cautious approach toward the cabin's front porch, Carter's fury reached new heights. "Traitors!" he shouted, firing wildly in their direction and forcing them to dive for cover. Eleanor had anticipated this reaction. She fired a rapid series of shots that pinned down Carter and his men, protecting Reeves and Davies as they scrambled behind a woodpile closer to the cabin. "Carter's lost control," Reeves called to Eleanor, keeping his head down as bullets splintered wood around him. "He's as much a threat to us as to you now." "Then our interests are temporarily aligned," Eleanor observed coolly, maintaining her tactical advantage. "What do you propose?" "A coordinated effort to neutralize Carter and his men," Reeves suggested, "followed by our complete withdrawal from your property with the evidence we discussed." Eleanor weighed this proposal against her other options. Allowing Reeves and Davies to assist would reduce the immediate threat, but creating any alliance with them carried its own risks. Before she could respond, the sound of galloping hooves drew everyone's attention. Through her mirrors, Eleanor spotted young Wyatt emerging from behind the stable on her chestnut mare, making a desperate dash toward the southern trail. Carter immediately redirected his fire toward the fleeing man. "Cover Wyatt's escape," Eleanor instructed Reeves, shifting her own position to get a clear shot at Carter. Reeves and Davies responded immediately, laying down suppressive fire that forced Carter and his men to seek better cover. Their coordinated action allowed Wyatt to make it safely into the tree line and disappear down the trail toward Pinecrest. The temporary alliance shifted the tactical balance decisively. With Reeves and Davies now actively opposing them, Carter and his two remaining men found themselves outflanked and outgunned. "Last chance, Carter," Reeves called out. "Drop your weapons and withdraw. There's nothing to be gained here except bullets." "You're a dead man, Reeves," Carter snarled back. "You think Montgomery will just let you walk away after this? He'll hunt you down like a dog." "Not if we have insurance," Reeves replied steadily, glancing toward the cabin where Eleanor maintained her vigilant watch. Carter's response was a renewed barrage of gunfire, more desperate than accurate. One of his men attempted to circle behind the stable for a better angle, not realizing he was moving directly into one of Eleanor's prepared fields of fire. "Your man by the stable should reconsider his approach," Eleanor called to Carter. "That position is covered by 3 separate firing angles." To demonstrate, she fired a shot that struck the dirt at the outlaw's feet, followed by another that clipped the brim of his hat. The man froze, then wisely dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Smith's out," Davies reported, his experienced eye noting the change in the tactical situation. "That leaves just Carter and Peterson." The momentum had shifted irrevocably. Carter found himself increasingly isolated as his second ally. Seeing Smith's surrender, began edging backward toward his horse. Within moments, the man had mounted and was galloping away, abandoning Carter to face the consequences of his defiance alone. "It's over, Carter," Reeves called, his voice carrying the weight of tactical certainty. "You're alone and exposed. Surrender. While you still can." Eleanor watched Carter carefully through her specialized sight. His body language revealed the dangerous unpredictability of a cornered predator. Shoulders tense, movements jerky, eyes darting between potential targets. She recognized the signs of a man preparing for one final desperate action. "Mr. Carter is considering a suicide charge," she observed calmly to Reeves. "His right hand is tensing, and he's shifting his weight onto his back foot for momentum." Reeves nodded in acknowledgement, impressed despite himself by the precision of her observation. Carter always was hot-headed, too quick to act, too slow to think. As predicted, Carter suddenly burst from behind his cover, firing wildly as he charged toward the cabin with reckless abandon. Eleanor had already anticipated this move, having observed similar desperate charges during the war. She fired a precisely calculated shot that struck Carter's right shoulder, causing him to spin and drop his weapon without inflicting a fatal wound. Carter fell hard, clutching his injured shoulder and cursing vehemently. The final threat neutralized. An uneasy silence fell over the property. "Your marksmanship remains impressive, Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves noted, stepping cautiously from behind the woodpile. "You could have killed him easily at that range." "Killing should always be the last resort," Eleanor replied, maintaining her position at the window. "A lesson the war taught me at great cost." She studied Reeves carefully through her sight as he approached Carter's prone form and secured the man's dropped weapons. Despite their temporary alignment against a common threat, Eleanor remained vigilantly aware that Reeves and Davies still represented potential dangers. "Your proposal, Lieutenant Reeves," she called, redirecting the conversation to their interrupted negotiation. "You mentioned a coordinated withdrawal and evidence against Montgomery. Let's discuss specific terms." Reeves straightened, his military bearing returning now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Complete withdrawal from your property and the surrounding territory. No further action against you or your land. In exchange, documentary evidence of Montgomery's operations sufficient to protect us from his reprisals." Eleanor considered his terms carefully. "And what guarantee do I have that you won't simply return with reinforcements once you've secured the evidence?" Reeves considered Eleanor's question about guarantees with the thoughtful calculation of a military strategist. "My word as an officer means little after my actions since the war," he acknowledged candidly. "But practical considerations offer better assurance than promises. Montgomery has connections, but his reach isn't infinite. With evidence of his operations in our possession, mutual deterrence becomes our protection." Eleanor maintained her vigilant position at the window, assessing both Reeves' words and his body language through her specialized sight. Years of experience reading men in high-pressure situations told her his pragmatic approach was genuine, even if his trustworthiness remained questionable. "There's another factor you should consider," she noted calmly. "Young Wyatt is currently riding to Pinecrest with instructions to share everything he knows about Montgomery's operations with Sheriff Collins. By tomorrow, territorial marshals will be investigating every aspect of these land acquisitions." This new information visibly impacted Reeves's tactical calculations. He exchanged a quick glance with Davies, their wordless communication revealing the depth of their partnership. "Then our window for establishing independent protection is closing rapidly," Reeves observed, "making our need for the documentation more urgent, not less." On the ground nearby, Carter groaned and clutched his wounded shoulder, his earlier bravado replaced by pained resignation. The man who had surrendered earlier, Smith, remained kneeling with his hands raised, uncertain of his fate as the negotiation continued. "Your practical assessment is sound," Eleanor acknowledged, "but incomplete. Documentation sufficient to protect you from Montgomery would also implicate you in his crimes. A difficult position when territorial marshals begin making arrests." Reeves nodded, accepting the validity of her point. "Then perhaps alternative terms might be more appropriate to our mutual interests." "I'm listening," Eleanor replied, still maintaining her tactical advantage despite the evolving situation. "Complete withdrawal as offered previously," Reeves began, his tone shifting to the formal cadence of official negotiation. "Plus, our testimony against Montgomery regarding his operations and methods. In exchange, your intervention with the territorial authorities, verification that Davies, myself, and our men cooperated in bringing Montgomery to justice." Eleanor considered this revised proposal carefully. Having former outlaws testify against Montgomery would significantly strengthen the case against him, potentially ensuring that justice would reach beyond mere triggerman to the true architect of the corruption. "Testimony would need to be comprehensive," she stated. "Every detail of Montgomery's operations, every instruction he provided, every official he compromised." "Understood and agreed," Reeves confirmed. "Davies and I maintained meticulous records of all operations, names, dates, payments. Montgomery insisted on detailed reporting. Your organizational tendencies from military service," Eleanor observed. Useful now in unexpected ways. Davies spoke up for the first time during the negotiation, his voice carrying the practical perspective of a seasoned veteran. Montgomery never suspected we'd keep our own set of records. Insurance, we called it. Never thought we'd actually need it. Through her specialized sight, Eleanor studied both men carefully. Their body language suggested genuine willingness to cooperate, driven more by self-preservation than any sudden moral awakening. Pragmatism rather than principle, but effective nonetheless for her purposes. "And Carter?" she inquired, nodding. Toward the wounded man, still lying in the dirt. Carter was running his own side operations without Montgomery's knowledge, Reeves revealed, including the more extreme violence against the Hanson family. His testimony would be valuable but problematic. He's directly implicated in multiple deaths. This explanation aligned with Eleanor's own intelligence gathering. She had suspected Carter's particularly vicious approach went beyond Montgomery's instructions, representing personal initiative rather than ordered action. "Very well," she decided. "I accept your revised terms with one addition. You'll surrender all weapons before approaching the cabin, and you'll be secured inside until arrangements can be made with Sheriff Collins." Reeves nodded his acceptance, recognizing the reasonable precaution. "Agreed." And Smith? Eleanor considered the surrendered outlaw, who had maintained his kneeling position throughout the negotiation. "He'll be secured as well, pending determination of his specific involvement." With terms established, Eleanor directed the careful disarming process from her protected position. Reeves and Davies removed their remaining weapons, placing them in a pile before approaching the cabin with hands visible. Smith followed their example, while Carter remained secured where he had fallen, his wound painful but not life-threatening. "Stop. At the porch steps," Eleanor instructed. "You'll find restraints hanging on the railing post. Secure yourselves and then proceed inside." Reeves raised an eyebrow at this prepared detail. "You anticipated taking prisoners." "I anticipated multiple scenarios," Eleanor corrected calmly. "Preparation for diverse outcomes was essential to my operational planning during the war." Old habits persist. Once the men had secured themselves with the specialized restraints designed to allow limited movement while preventing access to weapons, Eleanor directed them into the cabin through the front door. Only after they were safely inside did she emerge from her firing position, maintaining a careful distance as she verified their bonds. "Impressive modifications," Reeves noted, his experienced eye taking in the cabin's interior defenses, now visible from his new perspective. The reinforced walls, the concealed firing ports, the observation system. You've created a defensive position that would challenge a full military unit. 3 years of methodical preparation, Eleanor acknowledged, checking Carter's wound as the sullen outlaw sat heavily in a kitchen chair. "The bleeding is controlled. You'll survive to face justice, Mr. Carter." With her prisoners secured, Eleanor retrieved a medical kit from beneath a floorboard and tended to Carter's injury with clinical efficiency. Her actions were neither gentile nor rough, simply the practical ministrations of someone who had treated many battlefield wounds. "Why bother?" Carter muttered, wincing as she cleaned and bandaged his shoulder. "You should have finished the job." "Killing is easy, Mr. Carter," Eleanor replied evenly. "Living with the consequences is harder. I learned that lesson thoroughly during the war." While maintaining vigilant awareness of her prisoners, Eleanor moved to a concealed compartment behind a false section of bookshelf. From this hidden space, she retrieved a leather portfolio containing carefully preserved documents. "These are copies of essential evidence," she explained, spreading selected papers on the table. "Sufficient to demonstrate Montgomery's operations and your cooperation against him, without unnecessarily incriminating yourselves in matters unrelated to his land acquisition scheme." Reeves studied the documents with obvious admiration for their thorough organization. Your husband taught you his investigative methods. James taught me many things, Eleanor confirmed, a momentary softness entering her voice before her professional demeanor returned. But my organizational systems were developed during intelligence operations behind Confederate lines. When information could mean the difference between mission success and capture, meticulous documentation becomes second nature. She separated specific documents into distinct piles, her movements precise and deliberate. These will go to Sheriff Collins, these to Judge Carlton directly, and these will remain secured as insurance against future complications. As Eleanor organized the evidence, the morning had progressed to full day, sunlight streaming through the cabin's windows and illuminating dust motes disturbed by their movement. The transformation from pre-dawn tension to this strange aftermath created an almost surreal atmosphere. "I must admit, Mrs. Blackwood," Reeves observed, watching her systematic approach to the documentation, "when Montgomery assigned us this operation, I anticipated many potential outcomes, finding myself negotiating surrender terms with a former Union intelligence operative was not among them. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows, Eleanor maintained her vigilant supervision of her prisoners while completing the organization of evidence. The atmosphere had shifted from combat tension to an uneasy truce, punctuated by the occasional groan from Carter as his wounded shoulder throbbed. "Montgomery will have contingency plans," Reeves observed, breaking the extended silence. "He didn't build his empire by leaving himself vulnerable to betrayal." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "He already implemented one such contingency. 2 weeks ago, a professional gunman visited Pinecrest asking questions about the widow who lives alone in the hills. Fortunately, the townspeople are protective of their own." This information visibly surprised Reeves. "Montgomery sent someone in advance of our operation. He never mentioned this." "Compartmentalization," Eleanor explained, "a principle I suspect you understand from your military experience. Each operative receives only the information necessary for their specific task." Davies shifted uncomfortably in his restraints. "What happened to this gunman?" A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "He encountered unexpected difficulty during his reconnaissance, a regrettable accident involving a weakened bridge on the North Trail. He's currently recovering from 2 broken legs in Sheriff Collins' jail. And providing additional testimony against Montgomery, I imagine," Reeves noted, with grim appreciation. "Precisely." Eleanor sealed one of the document packets with wax, pressing her husband's official seal into the molten surface. "His willingness to cooperate increased significantly when I provided evidence connecting him directly to 3 unsolved murders. In Denver, through the cabin's windows, the distant sound of approaching horses caught everyone's attention. Eleanor moved smoothly to her observation position, using her network of mirrors to identify the riders without exposing herself directly. "Sheriff Collins," she announced after a moment, "accompanied by young Wyatt and 2 deputies. It seems your former associate delivered my message with commendable speed." Reeves straightened in his chair, military bearing returning despite his restraints. "He'll have described our operation in detail, not the most favorable first impression." "Actions have consequences, Lieutenant," Eleanor replied evenly, though without malice. "But your current cooperation will be noted as agreed." She moved to the door, opening it just as Sheriff Collins and his men reined in their horses before the cabin. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 50s with shrewd eyes that missed little, surveyed the scene with professional assessment. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called, tipping his hat politely despite the tension evident in his posture. "Young Wyatt here tells quite a tale. Says you've been holding off the entire Reeves gang single-handed since dawn." "A somewhat simplified account," Eleanor responded, gesturing toward the open door. 4 prisoners secured inside, 1 wounded, but stable. 3 more fled earlier, Torres and 2 others whose names I've documented. Collins dismounted, signaling his deputies to secure the perimeter. His experienced gaze took in the subtle modifications to the cabin, the strategic positioning of windows, the carefully maintained clear lines of fire. "You've been planning for something like this," he observed quietly as he approached the porch. "Planning for possibilities?" Eleanor corrected. "A habit developed during the war." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. "War, you say? Wouldn't be referring to your time with the Phantom Division, would you, Shadow Eleanor?" A momentary silence followed his words. Eleanor studied Collins with new intensity, reassessing everything she thought she knew about the seemingly provincial sheriff. "Few recognize that designation," she noted carefully. Collins removed his hat, revealing a faded scar that ran from his temple into his hairline. "Captain Michael Collins, 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, attached to Special Operations Command under Colonel Harker from 63 to 65. I was the supply officer who ensured your team had what they needed for the Chattanooga operation." Recognition dawned in Eleanor's eyes. The quartermaster who somehow procured Confederate uniforms with exactly the right regiment insignia. "Your attention to detail saved lives. And your team's intelligence gathering saved hundreds more," Collins replied, a new respect evident in his tone. "When you settled in my jurisdiction 3 years ago, I wondered if it was a coincidence. Now I'm thinking it wasn't." Eleanor gestured toward the interior of the cabin. "This conversation might be better continued inside, with reference to certain documents." Collins nodded his understanding, following her into the cabin where the prisoners watched this unexpected reunion with growing unease. The sheriff assessed each man with the practiced eye of a veteran lawman before turning his attention to the document packets Eleanor had prepared. "Montgomery," he stated rather than asking, examining the evidence. "I've suspected his involvement in territorial corruption for years, but could never prove it. My husband assembled most of this evidence," Eleanor explained, indicating the most comprehensive packet. "James was building a case against Montgomery's entire operation when he died in that riding accident 3 years ago." Collins' expression hardened. "I never believed that was an accident. The terrain where they found him was too familiar to an experienced rider." "It wasn't," Eleanor confirmed quietly. "But proving murder requires evidence I've only recently secured." She removed a folded paper from a hidden pocket sewn into her dress. This letter, in Montgomery's handwriting, instructing his agent to ensure Blackwood's permanent silence regarding the land claims investigation. The sheriff examined the document with careful attention, his experienced eye noting the distinctive handwriting and personal seal. "Where did you obtain this?" "From the effects of Montgomery's agent, after he attempted to eliminate me 6 months ago," Eleanor replied. "He'd preserved it as insurance against his employer, a common practice among those who serve corrupt men. Unfortunately for him, his ambush planning lacked the tactical awareness his mission required." Collins glanced up sharply. "You never reported an attempt on your life." "Some matters are better handled directly," Eleanor stated simply. "The man survived with valuable lessons about choosing his employers more carefully. He's currently operating a small trading post in California, having decided a change of scenery was advisable for his health." From his seat at the table, Reeves watched this exchange with growing understanding. "You've been systematically dismantling Montgomery's operation since you arrived," he observed, "using your husband's evidence as a foundation." "Completing James's work," Eleanor corrected, "and ensuring that his death served purpose beyond Montgomery's ambitions." She turned her attention back to Collins. "With these men's testimony and the consolidated evidence, we have sufficient material to present Judge Carlton with an irrefutable case against Montgomery and his entire organization." Collins nodded his agreement after examining the documents. Further, Carlton's been looking for an opportunity to move against Montgomery for years. This will give him everything he needs to issue warrants for the entire operation. Montgomery has protection in Denver, Carter interjected bitterly, speaking up from his position at the table. Politicians, businessmen, even a few judges, they won't let him fall easily. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but corruption requires darkness to thrive. Once exposed to sufficient light, even the most entrenched corruption becomes vulnerable. She indicated a specific document in the evidence packet. This list identifies every official who has accepted payments from Montgomery over the past 5 years, including amounts, dates, and the specific actions purchased with each payment. Collins whistled softly as he reviewed the detailed accounting. This will shake the territorial government to its foundations. Reform often requires disruption, Eleanor noted calmly. James believed the territory deserved honest governance, ensuring that outcome seems an appropriate memorial. Outside, the deputies had begun securing the perimeter of the property, collecting discarded weapons and examining the positions the outlaws had occupied during the confrontation. Through the window, Eleanor observed young Wyatt describing the morning's events to the deputies, his animated gestures suggesting the story was growing more dramatic with each telling. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's property as Sheriff Collins organized the secure transport of the prisoners. Deputies had fashioned a makeshift stretcher for Carter, whose wounded shoulder required medical attention beyond Eleanor's initial treatment. Reeves and Davies would ride with their hands bound, while Smith, the man who had surrendered early in the confrontation, would walk alongside the horses. "We should move them before dark," Collins advised, checking the restraints on each prisoner personally. "The road to Pinecrest gets treacherous after sunset, especially with prisoners." Eleanor nodded her agreement, though her attention had shifted. Do something beyond the immediate situation. A subtle tension had entered her posture, her gaze repeatedly scanning the distant ridgeline visible through her eastern window. "Something's troubling you," Collins observed quietly, noticing her vigilance. "Montgomery's thoroughness," she replied, keeping her voice low enough that the prisoners couldn't overhear. "The contingency Reeves mentioned earlier, it's been activated. By now, their failure to return on schedule would trigger predetermined countermeasures." Collins' expression darkened with understanding. "You're expecting additional visitors?" "I would be in Montgomery's position," Eleanor confirmed, moving to check her ammunition supplies. "He doesn't tolerate failure, and he protects himself by eliminating potential witnesses. These men know too much to be allowed to reach a courtroom." The sheriff absorbed this assessment with the gravity of a veteran who recognized legitimate threat analysis. How would he know they've been captured rather than delayed? "Montgomery employs telegraph operators in strategic locations," Eleanor explained, retrieving her specialized sight from its concealed compartment. "Including one in Miller's Creek, 15 miles west. Routine updates would be expected, and their absence would signal compromise." She attached the sight to her Winchester with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and precise. Additionally, Torres and the other deserters would likely seek protection by alerting Montgomery's agents to the situation here. Collins processed this information quickly, military experience evident in how swiftly he shifted from law enforcement to tactical thinking. How many would he send, and when? "Professional operators, not common outlaws," Eleanor assessed. "Probably 4 to 6 men with specialized skills. They would have deployed by mid-morning after the first missed check-in, which puts their arrival within the next hour if they're traveling at standard pace." From his position at the table, Reeves had been listening intently despite their lowered voices. "She's right," he confirmed, abandoning the pretense. "Montgomery maintains a security team separate from our operation. Former Pinkertons and military men discharged for excessive force. They handle problems deemed too sensitive for regular channels. Eleanor met his gaze directly. Names and descriptions? Reeves hesitated only briefly before making his decision. William Harding leads them. Former Army scout, expert tracker, Abel Forrest, ex-Pinkerton, specializes in quiet eliminations. Brothers Thomas and James Reed, sharpshooters from Burden's unit during the war. And Victor Sanchez, knife expert with experience in border conflicts. Eleanor nodded her appreciation for this critical intelligence. 5 operators with complementary skills, a formidable response team. More dangerous than any of us, Reeves added, nodding toward his fellow prisoners. They don't issue warnings or make demands. They simply eliminate problems with maximum efficiency. Collins turned to his deputies, who had been preparing the horses for transport. Change of plans. We're staying to secure the location. Harrison, post yourself at the north approach. Williams, cover the trail from the east. Maintain concealment and signal at first sight of riders. The deputies responded with immediate professionalism, retrieving their rifles and moving to their assigned positions without question. Young Wyatt, who had been helping secure the horses, looked uncertainly toward the sheriff. "What about me, sir?" Collins considered the young man thoughtfully. "You've demonstrated courage by bringing a warning to town. Now I need you to demonstrate discretion. Ride to Judge Carlton's office in Denver. Take the South Trail to avoid interception. Deliver this packet directly to him, no one else." The sheriff handed Wyatt the sealed document pouch Eleanor had prepared earlier. The young man accepted it with solemn understanding of its importance. "I won't fail you, sir, or you, Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor approached Wyatt, making a minor adjustment to his saddle before meeting his gaze directly. "The southeastern trail passes through Maple Canyon. There's a natural spring 2 miles in where you should water your horse. Behind the large boulder beside the spring, you'll find a cache containing food, ammunition, and a second sealed packet. Add that to the documents you're carrying." Wyatt's eyes widened at this revelation of her extensive preparation. "You've planned for every possibility, haven't you?" "Planning reduces the role of chance in determining outcomes," Eleanor replied simply. "Now go, before the light fades further." As Wyatt galloped south, Eleanor returned her attention to securing the cabin for the approaching threat. She moved methodically through each room, checking firing angles, ammunition placements, and defensive positions. "Your contingencies are impressive," Collins observed, as he helped position extra ammunition at strategic points throughout the cabin. Most people wouldn't have anticipated Montgomery sending a professional team to eliminate his own men. "Understanding your opponent's patterns reveals their likely responses," Eleanor explained, adjusting a mirror to provide better coverage of the western approach. "Montgomery has eliminated his own operatives on at least 3 previous occasions, when operations were compromised. It's a predictable response from a man who values security over loyalty." From his seat at the table, Davies watched their preparations with growing concern. "These men won't approach carelessly like we did. They'll study the terrain, identify defensive weaknesses, and develop a coordinated assault plan before making any move." "I'm counting on their thoroughness," Eleanor confirmed. "Professional caution extends their observation time, which gives us additional preparation advantages." She turned to Reeves, whose military experience made him the most valuable tactical resource among the prisoners. "If you were leading Montgomery's response team, how would you approach this situation?" Reeves considered the question carefully, his strategic mind engaging with the hypothetical scenario. "I'd establish surveillance from the northern ridge first, studying patterns and movements. Then I'd position shooters on elevated positions to the east and west, creating crossfire zones covering all exits. The main assault would come from the south, using the tree line for cover until the final approach." Eleanor nodded, having already anticipated similar tactics. "And timing? Dusk?" Reeves replied without hesitation. The transitional light creates visual confusion for defenders while providing sufficient visibility for coordinated movement. Approximately 30 minutes from now. Collins checked his pocket watch, confirming Reeves's estimate. That gives us limited time to enhance our defensive posture. The primary defenses are already established, Eleanor assured him, moving to a concealed cabinet beneath the kitchen floorboards. From this hidden compartment, she retrieved additional specialized equipment, signal flares, tripwires, and small mechanical devices Collins didn't immediately recognize. Perimeter alarms, she explained, noting his curious expression. They'll alert us to movement in specific zones without revealing our awareness of the intrusion. She handed several of the devices to Collins. These need to be positioned along the southern tree line, spaced approximately 20 yards apart. They're designed to blend with the natural environment while detecting movement through vibration sensors. As Collins examined the sophisticated devices, his expression revealed new appreciation for Eleanor's level of preparation. These aren't standard military issues. James designed them, she explained, a brief softness entering her voice. He combined his knowledge of land surveying equipment with mechanical innovations he developed during the war. The prototypes proved effective against Confederate night operations in the Shenandoah campaign. While Collins departed to position the perimeter sensors, Eleanor turned her attention to the prisoners. The tactical situation had created an unusual dynamic. Their safety now depended on the successful defense of the cabin against Montgomery's elimination team. Your restraints create vulnerability in a combat situation, she observed clinically. A calculated risk balanced against the possibility of internal threat. Reeves met her gaze directly. In these circumstances, our interests align perfectly. Montgomery's team won't distinguish between you and us once they attack. We're all witnesses to be eliminated. Eleanor considered this assessment, weighing tactical pragmatism against security concerns. After a moment's calculation, she made her decision. Davies, you served as a sharpshooter in the 7th Virginia before joining Reeves' cavalry unit, she stated rather than asked. Davies' surprise at her knowledge was evident. How did you... The callus pattern on your trigger finger indicates long rifle training, Eleanor explained, and you instinctively assessed range and wind conditions when you first approached the cabin, habits developed through specialist training. She unlocked his restraints with a small key from her pocket. The northwest window provides coverage of the likely sniper position on the ridge. There's a Sharps rifle positioned there with appropriate ammunition. Your skills would be better utilized defending that approach than sitting bound at this table. Dusk settled over the forest surrounding Eleanor's cabin, casting long shadows that blurred the distinction between solid objects and their darkening silhouettes. Inside, a coordinated defense had taken shape with surprising efficiency. Davies manned the northwest window, the Sharps rifle positioned perfectly for his specialized skills. Sheriff Collins had returned from placing the perimeter sensors and now covered the southern approach. Eleanor maintained her mobile defense strategy, moving between positions to maximize coverage of all vulnerable points. Even Reeves had been conditionally released from his restraints, though Eleanor had assigned him to a position where Collins could monitor him while he covered the eastern window with a Spencer carbine. First signal trip, Eleanor announced quietly, noting the subtle indicator light that had illuminated on a small wooden box near the kitchen. Northern perimeter, approximately 80 yards out. They're being cautious, testing for defensive measures. Collins nodded, adjusting his position slightly to maintain coverage while reducing his own visibility. Williams would have signaled if they'd approached from the East Trail. They're moving through the forest instead, using terrain to mask their approach, Reeves confirmed, his military assessment aligning with Eleanor's. Standard procedure for Montgomery's team. Harding will have them spread in a semicircle, maintaining communication through predetermined signals. Another indicator light activated on Eleanor's monitoring device. Western perimeter now. They're establishing containment before committing to assault positions. Davies shifted the Sharp's rifle minutely, compensating for the fading light with practiced adjustment of his sight picture. Movement on the ridge, he reported softly. Single figure setting up position. Range approximately 300 yards. That'll be Thomas Reed, Reeves identified. The more patient of the brothers, he specializes in overwatch positions, while James typically takes mobile shooting roles. Eleanor moved to a specialized observation port near her chimney, using her custom-designed optics to scan the northern ridge. Through the enhanced sight, she located the distant figure, a man setting up a professional shooting position with methodical precision. He's establishing a final firing position, she analyzed, but hasn't mounted his scope yet. We have perhaps 3 minutes before he's fully operational. Collins glanced at her quickly. Recommendations? Davies has the necessary angel and equipment, Eleanor replied, turning to the former outlaw. Can you make that shot with the current light conditions? Davies assessed the challenge with professional detachment. 300 yards with this. Sharps? Yes, with proper elevation. But if I miss, we lose the element of surprise. You won't miss, Eleanor stated with quiet certainty. Your shooting stance has the precision of someone who is an expert at ranges beyond 500 yards. The callus patterns on your hands match those of dedicated long-range marksmen. Davies blinked, surprised by her confidence in his abilities based on such subtle observations. With renewed determination, he settled into position, adjusting the rifle's elevation with meticulous care. Wait for my signal, Eleanor instructed, moving to check another perimeter indicator that had just activated. Southern approach now compromised. They're establishing a complete cordon. Through her observation network, Eleanor tracked the methodical deployment of Montgomery's team. Their professionalism was evident in their patient, coordinated approach, so different from the initial assault by Reeves's men that morning. These were experienced operators who understood the principles of tactical advantage. Ready, Davies whispered, his breathing controlled as he maintained perfect sight alignment on the distant figure. Eleanor waited for the precise moment when the team would be most vulnerable, committed to their positions, but not yet fully prepared to execute their assault. Years of combat experience had taught her to recognize this critical window when attackers were most exposed. Now, she directed calmly. Davies exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The Sharp's rifle cracked sharply in the quiet evening air. Through her specialized optics, Eleanor watched the distant figure on the ridge jerk backward, dropping his equipment as he clutched his shoulder and scrambled for cover. Hit, Davies confirmed, clean through the right shoulder, non-lethal as requested. Well placed, Eleanor acknowledged, already moving to her next position. Sheriff, they'll accelerate their timeline now. Expect immediate response from the southern approach. Collins nodded grimly, adjusting his coverage to anticipate the reaction. Within moments, movement erupted along the tree line as Montgomery's team abandoned their measured approach in favor of immediate action. 2 figures moving rapidly from the west, Reeves reported from his position. Using alternating cover patterns, definitely Forrest and Sanchez based on their movement styles. Eleanor had anticipated this response. She triggered one of her prepared defensive measures, a series of pre-positioned signal flares that ignited simultaneously along the western approach. The sudden illumination caught the advancing men in exposed positions, momentarily blinding them and disrupting their coordinated movement. "South clear," Collins called, having checked his sector during the distraction. "East approach still secure," Reeves confirmed. Through her network of mirrors, Eleanor tracked the disoriented operators as they sought new cover from the unexpected illumination. Their professional discipline was evident even in how they responded to the setback. No wasted movement, no panicked reactions. They'll regroup and attempt simultaneous approach from multiple directions, she predicted, moving to activate another defensive system. Standard response to unexpected resistance. From his position at the northwest window, Davies tracked movement with his reloaded sharps. Second shooter establishing position on the western ridge, attempting to use trees for concealment. James Reeves identified. He'll try for quick shots between coverage rather than fixed position shooting. Eleanor moved to the western window, bringing her Winchester to bear. Through her specialized sight, she located the second sharpshooter as he attempted to establish a firing position that balanced concealment with effective angle. "I have him," she stated calmly, then fired a precisely calculated shot that splintered the tree bark inches from Reed's head, sending wooden fragments into his face and forcing him to abandon his position. As the tactical exchange continued, a new figure appeared at the edge of the forest, a well-dressed man in an expensive coat, flanked by two armed guards. Even in the fading light, his commanding presence and aristocratic bearing marked him as someone accustomed to authority. "Montgomery," Eleanor whispered, recognizing the man from the photographs in her husband's files. "He's come himself." Collins stared in disbelief. "That's unexpected. He never puts himself in harm's way. He doesn't trust others to handle failure," Reeves explained tensely. "When operations go wrong, he sometimes appears to take personal control." Eleanor's expression hardened as she studied the man responsible for her husband's death. For 3 years, she had prepared for this moment, gathering evidence, building her case, and creating the fortress that would enable her to face him on her terms. "He's carrying a speaking trumpet," she observed through her specialized optics, preparing to issue demands or offer terms. Sure enough, Montgomery raised the trumpet to his lips. "Mrs. Blackwood," his voice carried clearly across the clearing, "this confrontation is unnecessary. I've come to offer you a generous settlement for your property, $50,000, far above market value." Eleanor moved to a position where she could respond without exposing herself. "My property isn't for sale, Mr. Montgomery," she called back, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "Neither is justice for my husband's murder." A momentary silence followed her words before Montgomery spoke again. "I had nothing to do with your husband's unfortunate accident. However, I'm willing to contribute to a memorial fund in his name as part of our agreement." "I have the letter, Montgomery," Eleanor responded. "The one you sent to your agent ordering James's permanent silence. Your handwriting, your personal seal, along with documented evidence of every land fraud you've orchestrated across the territory." Through her sight, Eleanor watched Montgomery's composed facade crack slightly, his hand tightening around the speaking trumpet. "Whatever documents you think you have are forgeries," he countered, though uncertainty had entered his tone. "But I'm a reasonable man. Let's discuss terms that could benefit us both." "The only terms I'm interested in discussing," Eleanor replied coldly, "are those you'll hear from Judge Carlton when you're brought before his court." Montgomery's expression darkened. "You're making a grave error, Mrs. Blackwood. No one refuses. Sebastian Montgomery and prospers. You killed the wrong man's wife," Eleanor stated with deadly certainty, "and I've spent 3 years ensuring you'll answer for it." She nodded to Davies, who adjusted his aim and fired a precisely calculated shot that struck the ground directly between Montgomery's feet. The railroad magnate stumbled backward in shock as his guards drew their weapons, scanning frantically for the source of the shot. "That was courtesy of the Phantom Division, Mr. Montgomery," Eleanor called out. "The next one won't miss. Your team is already neutralized, your operation compromised, and evidence of your crimes en route to Judge Carlton in Denver. The territorial governor will receive copies by morning." Montgomery's face contorted with rage as he realized the extent of his defeat. "Who are you?" he demanded. "The widow you underestimated," Eleanor answered simply. "The wife of the man you murdered, the justice you can't escape," with a gesture. To his remaining men, Montgomery retreated to the tree line, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. Through her observation network, Eleanor tracked their hasty departure, not a tactical withdrawal, but a full retreat. "He'll run for the border," Reeves predicted, watching Montgomery's disappearing figure. "He keeps emergency funds and documentation." "In Wyoming territory, he won't make it," Collins stated confidently. "I dispatched telegrams to all neighboring jurisdictions before coming here. Every sheriff and marshal within 200 miles will be watching for him." As the forest fell silent once more, Eleanor finally stepped away from her firing position. 3 years of single-minded purpose, gathering evidence, preparing defenses, waiting for the perfect moment, had culminated in this day of reckoning. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood in Judge Carlton's Denver courtroom as the verdict was read. Sebastian Montgomery, railroad magnate and land speculator, found guilty on all counts: fraud, corruption, and the murder of federal land agent James Blackwood. The evidence she had meticulously compiled, combined with testimony from Reeves and his men, had created an irrefutable case. As Montgomery was led away in chains, Judge Carlton approached Eleanor. "An extraordinary achievement, Mrs. Blackwood. Your husband would be proud. James believed in justice through evidence and law, not just guns," Eleanor replied quietly. "I tried to honor that belief." The territorial governor was impressed by your methodical approach, Carlton continued. "He's establishing a new investigative division within the marshal's office and needs someone with your unique skills to lead it." Eleanor considered the offer thoughtfully. For 3 years, vengeance had been her sole purpose. Now, with that chapter closed, a new possibility presented itself, using her abilities to bring systematic justice to the frontier. The division would need proper resources, she noted. Trained investigators, laboratory equipment, documentation. "Systems," Carlton smiled, recognizing her implicit acceptance. "The governor anticipated your requirements. He's already approved the budget." 1 month later, Eleanor Blackwood stood in her cabin for the final time. The fortress that had served her so well was being transformed, not abandoned, but repurposed. The defensive modifications would remain, but the space would now serve as a training facility for the territory's first generation of scientific investigators. As she packed the last of James's photographs, a knock sounded at the door. Sheriff Collins stood on her porch, hat in hand. "The first recruits arrive tomorrow," he reported. 6 men and 2 women were selected from across the territory, all with aptitudes similar to what you specified. Eleanor nodded her approval. "Good. We'll start with evidence preservation techniques and scene documentation." Collins hesitated briefly. "They're nervous about training under the legendary Shadow Eleanor." A small smile touched her lips. "They shouldn't be. Shadow Eleanor was a weapon of war. Chief Investigator Blackwood is a builder of justice." As she closed the cabin door behind her, Eleanor gazed across the property that had been both her refuge and her battleground. The widow's cabin would now serve a greater purpose. Much like the widow herself, the frontier was changing, and Eleanor Blackwood would help shape that change, transforming frontier justice from fast guns to methodical investigation, one case at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.